What is the basis for persistent reports that Palestinians engaged in mass organized sexual violence against Israeli women last October? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Muin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Arun Gupta. Arun Gupta is an investigative reporter who has written for The Guardian, The Daily Beast, The Intercept, The Washington Post, and other publications. You can follow his reporting on Substack. Arun Gupta, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thanks so much for having me on, Moin.
We're talking about a story that has its roots in events last year. So perhaps we should start by recounting the claims and allegations that were made at the time. What exactly have Israel and its advocates been asserting about what happened on October 7th?
So I think let's look at this from the perspective of a story, a narrative. It's a grotesque fairy tale, and understanding that helps us understand the entire arc of what's been going on now for over 7 months. And the reason, let's put this right up top. The reason this matters so much is to this day, over 7 months later, Israel is still using these claims that and the claims are very specific. Hamas carried out a premeditated campaign of mass rape on October 7th. Sometimes they won't say
Rape and other forms of sexual violence.
and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence,
Mhm.
and that it was premeditated, it was deliberate, but Israel is still using this claims to this day to argue before the International Court of Justice that sexual violence is a justification for it to basically go in and genocide Rafah, right? To just and where it's caused most of Palestinians who've been displaced 5, 6, 7 times to flee yet again in these horrific
But
circumstances.
but they put forward more than just a general claim that there was organized mass rape. They also put forward very many specific allegations. Could you remind us what these were?
So this is where it really starts to get very dodgy, right? Because Israel is making all these claims, and you see it just amplified by media in the Western world that there's all this evidence, all these witnesses, there's all these victims, and this is from the beginning. And the first claims are literally coming out hours after the October 7th attack happens, right? I believe it was the Times of Israel starts the same day is already making allegations of sexual violence. Now, and so I was suspicious from the very beginning. And when I started to really look into the story in November, what I discovered, there started to be all these media investigations. The big one we're going to talk about is the New York Times one from December 28th, but Washington Post, Reuters, BBC, CNN, on and on. All the big media that are left were doing an investigation and claiming that there's all this evidence of mass rape on October 7th. But what I started to notice, and I created this database, is just like these stories just all sound the same, right? It struck me as kind of like QAnon, that they say do your own research, and yet they all come to the same exact wacky conclusion. And so when I created this database, what I discovered is 12 sources account for the vast majority of rape claims that you
Sorry,
see.
12 sources of
Human
human
sources.
sources as
Yeah,
in
people who claim
victims of sexual violence or
no,
people
no
talking about it.
victims, no victims. We're talking about, there's two people who claim they actually witnessed gang rapes, and that there are 10 people who claim they have post-mortem evidence that sexual violence, rape occurred. So then when you start to see who these 12 people are, 11 of the 12 are connected to the Israeli military and police. And that right there is all one really needs to know. If we had a media that actually held power accountable, because everyone in the world knows that Israel lies virtually more than any other nation in the world. Their propaganda, what they call Hasbara, is exposed time and again. You know, the tunnels under hospitals, beheaded baby,
But let me challenge you on that, because in any normal society, wouldn't it be the police that would have the evidence of these kinds of crimes and allegations?
well, 10 of the 11 were Israeli military or connected to the Israeli military. The one connected to the police is a woman who has never publicly come forward. She's only known as Sapir or Witness S. She first word is the first that's known of her is police at a press conference play a 3.5 minute video where she's making these claims that she witnessed gang rape, and this woman is being hacked apart. And kind of a content warning. Some of this stuff does get pretty graphic. I'll try and keep it as, not detailed as possible. So in any case, she's claiming that Hamas militants are cutting off her breasts with a box cutter and then playing with them, and the police would not take any questions. And so this kind of like ricochets around the media a lot. And then when the
In
New York
October.
in November, early
November.
November.
Yeah.
And then the following month, the New York Times does its big investigation that has now completely fallen apart. Screams without words, where they claim there's all this evidence that Hamas carried out a campaign of sexual violence on October 7th, saying that there are dozens of victims. They very prominently featured Sapir. They're still the only media outlet to have interviewed her. Her story gets more outlandish. She's now claiming there were 100 militants. They were gang raping and killed 5 women. They were chopping off body parts. They were having sex with corpses. They beheaded 3 other women and were, in her words, doing everything to their heads, which doesn't leave much to the imagination. And yet somehow, and she was had attended the Supernova music festival, and somehow she's the only one who sees this, despite the fact that there are over 100 militants and 8 dead women. There's no evidence. This would leave so much forensic evidence, and yet none has ever been offered. The Israeli police have said they have over 60,000 video files, and yet there is zero evidence. I have reviewed everything that's publicly available, and there is zero evidence of sexual assault, sexual violence. And Pramila Patten, the UN special representative who went to Israel to investigate this, who had no actual investigative powers, all she was doing was collecting information that already existed. But she said that in all the video, and she had the cooperation of the Israeli government, and we can talk about this more. Patton has some serious credibility issues herself, where she in the past has amplified fake claims. And I'll just say quickly, actually, that she amplified these fake claims that Russia had these rape rooms in Ukraine where they were giving Russian soldiers Viagra and raping Ukrainian women and girls. And this allegation is actually an old fake atrocity propaganda from when NATO overthrew Gaddafi and his government in 2011. Right. So Patton has these credibility problems. But even despite these credibility problems and the notion that she's just going to amplify Israeli propaganda, she also says, and presumably she is able to see many more video files and photos that are publicly available. She says there's no evidence that sexual violence happened.
Even
So
though her report was presented as clinching the argument in the media.
Oh, I mean, it's awful, her report, and, I've shared with you this, article, that, I'm going to publish soon, where major media outlets, 6 major media outlets completely botch their reporting on Patton's report, because Patton is very clear. She has no investigative powers, and that means, and they state outright in the report, we cannot attribute um, a, a allegations of sexual violence to any particular group. We're not able to do that. And yet there's 6 media outlets, including the Washington Post, including BBC, big media outlets, who then report Patton said Hamas did it. Right. So, I mean, they fail even basic reading comprehension. That's how bad the reporting is on this. But in terms of speaking of Patton's report, if you actually read it, and I do something that apparently media don't know how to do anymore, which is to actually read these reports. Time and again, she says, no evidence, no evidence, no evidence. Now, in the beginning, she claims there are reasonable grounds to believe there are 3 incidents of rape slash sexual violence. But if you then look through UN material, what is reasonable grounds? It's actually a very low level of proof. The only time that she actually says that there's credible information is in the case of hostages.
Mhm.
And then there is the case of this one Israeli woman, I think her name is Amet Susana, who was held as a hostage in Gaza, and she came forward and told her story to the New York Times, and I think her story is 100% credible, right? Because it's she 2 months before her story was published by the Times, another hostage who had been in contact with her told the story of without naming her, and the details matched up. Susanna told doctors after she was released in November, and again the details matched up. It's also when you start to get into the specific details, it just like it makes sense. It has a credibility to it and that's the thing about her story. What makes her story so believable is precisely what makes all the other Israeli claims completely unbelievable. And her story also
Can
undermines.
you elaborate on that?
Well, it's that, so she talks about how she was being held in Gaza, and at one point, as Israel is carrying out this massive genocide, she's being held by this one young militant. There's no one in contact. Everyone is suffering greatly. Hamas is being targeted, so this young militant is in charge of her for weeks. He's starting to obsess over her. Clearly he's interested in, sexually taking advantage of her. And it builds up to and he's asking her if she's, menstruating. And so finally it builds up to the moment, and she describes the details. And it's kind of like the absurd little things that would be extremely difficult to invent, right? Where after, and so it doesn't, the New York Times never even says rape, right? What it says is sexual assault, okay? So, but let's just say, right, okay, so this is what happened. After it happened, he comes back in. This happened in the bathroom, and she was naked, and minutes after it happened, he's feeling guilty and remorseful, and he says, please don't tell Israel what happened. I mean, it just sounds like some just kid who is completely out of his depth. He's acting out of hate and rage and whatever, and sexually assaults her, and then has these guilty feelings, right? It is so specifically detailed that it makes that, okay, this really sounds like something that happened. Whereas you get these stories, and like I said, it's only 2 witnesses. Now there are a couple of other witnesses who claim they saw rape, and there's also now this absurd category. So there's eyewitnesses, and now there's ear witnesses, right? Like guys who've come forward claiming that they heard rape. And one guy, it's so ridiculous. He told the BBC, and they don't even like this is crazy. This is ridiculous that he claimed he heard Hamas militants raping a corpse. And I'm like, how exactly do you hear that happening? It's and the BBC doesn't think to be like, oh yeah, this is absurd. But that's the thing about the media is they will like print any absurd allegation. Just to give an example, I just watched this some sort of news short or documentary where this woman, Israeli woman, claimed that this 10-year-old Palestinian super terrorist killed 50 Israelis on October 7th. Right. And it's just like you as a news producer and the editorial team are deciding this is credible, that should be aired. And it's just like, okay, this is so ridiculous, right? A 10-year-old is like killing dozens and dozens of Israelis, almost single-handedly responsible for 10% of all of the 695 Israeli citizens who died
Millions.
on October 7th.
Mm.
So it's the Sapir witness S story is just so absurd. The other witness who claims there was gang rape, Roz Cohen, his story kept changing. He initially claimed, and again, his initial story sounds credible, that some women or multiple women were killed with knives, right? And that is consistent. But when he starts talking about the rape stories, then it starts to keep changing. And that's what happens with these other witnesses. So the other 10 witnesses are claiming they witnessed stuff post mortem. Of these 10 witnesses, 5 of them are Zaka volunteers.
Tell us,
Zaka,
tell us about Zaka.
Zaka is this Haredi, which is means they're ultra orthodox Jewish organization that was set up in the 1990s. Israel is the only state in the world that privatizes a lot of its emergency services. So they took on the task of collecting human remains after mass casualty attacks, right? That could be a bad traffic incident, but it could also be, say, like a bombing of a bus, which was going on in the 1990s as Israel was locked in conflict with these various Palestinian militant groups. And so they I wrote about this for The Intercept, and the story is just so unbelievably outrageous and absurd. I say it's like Enron meets Epstein Island meets George Santos, and it's even crazier than that. Basically, they were bankrupt on October 7th, and by all evidence and appearances, they struck a deal with the Israeli government. The Israeli government, Israeli military is what I call the second most sophisticated military in the world after the Pentagon. They have an entire military unit dedicated to going into active combat zones and recovering human remains and preserving evidence. They were immediately mobilized to do that after October 7th. And they were told by the Home Command to stand down. And the commanders of this unit were not given a reason, and they were begging to be allowed in. Instead, Israel lets in these Zaka volunteers who not only are they completely untrained because they're ultra Orthodox Jews, they are actually hostile to collecting forensic evidence because they believe it violates halakha, Israel is Jewish law, and that the corpses must be buried as soon as possible. And so Israel lets them in to recover the remains. What does Israel get out of it? They get atrocity stories. And as we know, Israel has such impunity, thanks to its protector, the United States, that they don't hide anything. So with the genocide, we see all this incitement to genocide that's still going on. So when it comes to their propaganda, there's various high-ranking Israeli officials who are, and there's even a video in the great documentary done by Al Jazeera on October 7th. Netanyahu praising the men of Zaka, sitting around a table with them, talking about how important their stories, i.e., propaganda, has been to the war effort. There are other Israeli Hasbara officials, senior Hasbara officials, who are even more explicit. One in the National Information Directorate, a volunteer consultant, gave this did this interview with Yehudot Araknot, in which he
The
says
Israeli newspaper.
the Israeli newspaper that's been likened to the New York Times of Israel. He said that after October 7th, the entire state of Israel was focused on fixing the narrative that Hamas equals ISIS. And you heard this from all the senior Israeli officials, as well as President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, days after October 7th. They're all saying Hamas is ISIS or worse than ISIS or Nazis, right? Because that means they're kind of this evil that stands outside history. And so the world must unite to exterminate them completely, right? If Hamas is just treated as a combatant group in conflict with Israel, then it's a very different story about, well, then you need to have negotiations, truce, et cetera, and so on. So this is a narrative that Israel was focused on fixing. And this official goes on to say, Western reporters did not know what was going on here, and the gracious men of Zaka, were instrumental in convincing them that we're dealing with human monsters, and this deepened the legitimacy of the Israeli state to act with great force. Meanwhile, and this is a George Santos part, Zaka officials, including one of the most notorious ones, Yossi Landau, who has just been debunked, shown to be a serial liar. I found four different videos of him talking openly of fabricating stories, saying things like, we use our imagination. When we go into the houses, the bodies is telling us stories. Another senior Zaka official in an Israeli foreign ministry video talks about fabricating stories, saying the walls, the stones, they screamed rape, right? So they're outright admitting that they're using
Their imagination.
they're fabricating stories, and then you have the Israeli officials admitting they're using it in service of justifying the genocide, which they're continuing to do this day before the ICJ. So what's in it for Zaka? Well, Zaka was bankrupt on October 7th
And having
because
some legal issues, I believe.
the founder of the group, Yehuda Meshizahav, in 2021, he was announced he was going to be awarded the Israel Prize, which is a high civilian prize, like the American Presidential Medal of Freedom. And that was too much for his victims. All these Israelis came out of the woodwork to say he had raped them when they were children. So he, over 40 years, along with two of his brothers, raped at minimum scores, and it looks like hundreds of Israeli boys, girls, and young women were doing it flagrantly, openly. One incident, a young woman comes into his office and she's asking him for help because a lot of these ultra orthodox families live in poverty because they have so many kids and don't have any marketable skills, and she's asking him for financial support, and he starts to sexually assault her with the door open and other people in the office, and no one is doing anything or saying anything. And another young woman she ran out of there, another young woman who he did sexually assault, afterwards, he told her, if you say anything, you're going to get run over by a Zaka van. The thing is, everyone knew. According to reports, police opened multiple investigations of them and closed them, and including surfacing all these victims, 14 victims in one case, seven basically runaway girls that him and one of his brothers were sexually assaulting. They were using Zaka resources. They were giving them money, using Zaka vehicles in which they committed the assault, according to these reports. They were giving them phones, and the rabbis in the community knew. And the modesty patrols in the community knew. The victims talk about how the modesty patrols knew. The whole story is just so crazy because when you boil it down, what it turns out is that Zaka is responsible for more actual rapes of Israelis, children, and young women than all the fake claims about Hamas combined. Right. And so when this is exposed, Zaka basically goes into the death spiral. And the Enron part is from the moment they're set up, it appears, Yehudi Meshi Zahav and his brothers set up a dozen shell organizations. They're fundraising all over the world. They're raking in millions of dollars. They're not paying vendors. We know all this because by the early 2000s, there's already court appointed fiscal overseers of Zaka who are documenting all this and demanding that Meshi Zahav and his brothers stop this, and they refuse to. They're taking 50% off the top of everything they raise, plus expenses, and very little of the money is finding its way into Zaka coffers. Meanwhile, Meshi Zahav and his family are living in a multi-million dollar villa. They're getting new cars. They're taking first class plane flights to five-star luxury resorts. They're getting their grocery bills paid for. And since October 7th, I identified over $10 million that they have raised. And I think it's actually far more. So this is just the most grotesque scam, and the actual reality is a complete inversion of what's going on, and that's the real story of what these rapes are about. So five of those 10 volunteers are or
Five
sorry,
of the
five of
10
those 10
sources.
sources who are claiming post-mortem, and all these Zaka volunteers like, oh, we found this female body with its legs spread and objects in the sexual organ. I mean, they make the most outlandish claims, which is like, I'm sorry, but there would be tons of photographic and video and forensic evidence. Like another one, Simcha Grineman, he claims that they found foreign fighters, evidence of foreign fighters on October 7th. What was his evidence? It was that they had their IDs with them, because if you're invading another country,
Don't forget your ID.
you're going to bring your ID with you. I mean, it's just so ridiculous, and yet the media completely took them seriously. Now, the interesting thing is, after my report, you don't hear anything more about Zaka. The media have not picked up my report because I'm just like, the real story is so crazy. If you just turn it into a screenplay, you would be branded as the worst Nazi for the rest of your life. So, one of Simcha Grineman's stories, which actually made its way into the Patton report, again, this is absurd, that naked women were bound to trees at the Supernova Music Festival with metal objects inserted into their sexual organs and bodies. And it's just like, the amount of forensic evidence would be huge. Oh, and you can find videos of Israeli police taking photos and videos of post-mortem victims and massacre sites from October 7th. So where is the evidence? There is no evidence. And that right there tells you it's a lie. Then other five individuals who claim they saw post-mortem sexual violence are all tied to the Israeli military. Three of them are from the Shura military base, which was the one of the main forensic units. The Sherry Mendez, she was put out as put in front of the cameras. So let me back up a bit, because what happens immediately after October 7th is Israeli officials at the very topmost level, and this is amplified by Joe Biden, start making these outrageous lies about babies, right? And there's endless stories.
Babies put in ovens, babies hung from clotheslines, babies
Babies on
being
clotheslines, 40 dead babies, 8 dead babies. One baby was killed. She was held in her mother's arm in a safe room, and a bullet came through the door. And that was 10-month-old Mila Cohen. That is the only Israeli baby that died. A pregnant Bedouin woman was also shot, and her 9-month unborn fetus died. Doctors tried to save it, but only one baby. So there's all these outrageous claims being made, and you have even like military officials, like high-ranking, talking about carrying these decapitated, burnt babies. All complete lies. One admitted he made up this story about the 8 dead babies and children hung on a clothesline. So at this time this is going on, Israeli officials are also making these rape claims. But because the baby stories were so outrageous, and Biden repeated them 3 times, including as late as December, even after he was warned before the first time not to repeat it because
well, he
his
didn't just repeat them. He said he saw the pictures.
right, he said he saw pictures, and his staff told him that basically this is lies, and he goes ahead and repeats it anyway.
Arun, I want to just
So
go
let
back.
me finish this
Yeah,
part real quick.
please. Yeah.
So the rape claims start to come out immediately after October 7th, but the media start to walk them back, like NBC News and LA Times, because they said they haven't been verified. Also, at the same time, right, forensics is central to all this, which is why the role of Zaka is key, because they completely destroyed the forensics. They're hostile to forensics, but Israel was giving tours of their 2 main forensic facilities, Shura and the National Forensic Labs. They were doing media tours, and they were claiming that they had evidence of rape. And then they went silent for about a week or two, and then they start to put these volunteers and these people who have no expertise, the Zaka volunteers, Sherry Mendez, who's a reservist, who's a mom from New Jersey, who's an architect, the Unit 669 paramedic, right, who's anonymous. No one has, he may have been identified, but in any case, they then switch to, instead of putting doctors and the actual medical personnel who can talk about what evidence they have, they put these people who have no expertise and start to make these completely wild claims. So this is part of the propaganda effort, because it's also then easy to disassociate from them if their stories are discredited. And so that's what happens. And basically, this crescendo builds throughout November. And the real strategy that's going on is they wanted to keep alive the outrage about October 7th, because after a while, when Israel's killing, massacring tens of thousands of Palestinians in the most horrific and brutal ways, you can't keep claiming to be like, well, they killed 695 people on October 7th. So Israel is weaponizing these fake rape claims to keep the outrage going, because one, it's the cover for genocide. Two, it whips Israeli society in this complete frenzy, right? This is part of the colonial trope that has been going on for 500 years. It goes back to these what's called captivity narratives with the Native Americans in colonial America in the 1700s, which are these fictional stories of.
I wanted to actually get to that and learn more about it, but I just want to make clear the issue is not whether there was or was not any sexual violence on October 7th. I think it's a fair assumption that, as in any other armed conflict, there would not be a great surprise to learn that there was sexual violence. There's a specific allegation here, which you mentioned earlier, of mass organized, premeditated campaign of rape and sexual violence. And that's really what we're discussing here. And in your latest article, which is yet to be published, You also make a point of placing this in the context of not only the Middle East, but the broader context of colonial history. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. I mean, I will just say from my perspective, I am willing because I have been following this story just incredibly close.
Mhm.
One editor at the Intercept, Ryan Grimm, when he saw my research, which somehow worked its way into an Intercept article without credit, said, "You know more about this than anyone else out there." And I will debate anyone at this point and say there was zero sexual violence. Gender-based violence is something else. There's zero sexual violence that actually occurred on October 7th itself.
And the one
The
credible
one case
in view took
it
place
happened
after in captivity.
weeks after Ahmed Susana, she was in captivity. It sounds like it happened in either late October or sometime in November. She was released, obviously, in late November with those other
And
hostages,
and
right?
and you make the point that generally speaking, this type of violence tends to occur when there's long-term control over the victims, rather than, let's say, in the space of a battle lasting only a few hours.
Right. I mean, there's obviously plenty of cases where you have invading forces will come in and murder and rape. But the thing is, within 2 hours, if not less, the Israeli military was already counterattacking with helicopter units. And so the idea that this is all happening in this incredibly compressed time frame, and like I said, I have looked at hundreds of videos and photos, and it gets sickening after a while. And it's very clear what Hamas was doing on October 7th. They came to kill and to take hostages. And that's what you see in these videos, people being killed and people being taken hostages. And that's all anyone has been able to show, right? The Al Jazeera October 7th documentary, they have footage that I haven't seen anywhere else. They somehow got access to. They show people being dragged on foot, literally back to Gaza. So there is zero evidence that this happened, but I just wanted to point that out. So there is this basically this colonial trope, right, that goes back to the Western conquest and genocide of Native Americans, and that keeps getting
Updated.
recycled. What's that?
Updated.
Yes, yes, throughout history.
Mhm.
So, and it completely inverts the reality, right? Because what were the conquistadors in particular, the Spanish, doing? And they were raping indigenous women on this massive scale, and they were doing it. They were got had the blessing by the royal law, by church law. They were allowed to do this, right? But it gets completely twisted because in these captivity narratives, the fictional ones, right? There's also memoirs. In the fictional ones, they tend to end one of two ways. If they were written by women, it's either that the women are like sexually assaulted, then killed, or
Spanish
the
women.
colonizers. This was often
Yes.
English, right? This
Yes.
is the 1700s when they became popular.
Mhm.
So English, German, whatever. I think a lot of it was English because in terms of I've read like scholarly articles about captivity narratives and these questions, and a lot of these narratives look to be English language, and so they commit suicide to preserve their purity. In reality, what's going on is right. Native Americans, nations are often, taking. Uh, colonial colonizers captive. Sometimes they are torturing them and killing them, but often they're adopting them into their society to replace members who had been killed. And often, what happens, and there's all these memoirs of women and men who fully become part of the native society and then see this as their real family. And they would be captured back by whites. Some of them are like, but then they'll run away to join their native communities. And the reality is there's extremely little evidence that there was any rape of European women by Native Americans, whereas the rape and sexual violence was being perpetrated, right, by the colonizers. Then, with the slave era that's growing up at the same time, rape and sexual violence is inherent to slavery. That's how you make more slaves, when you have chattel slavery of Africans, right, from one generation to the next. So it was an economic incentive, it was law. The slave owners would do it for sadism, for pleasure, to make more property. Then during the 1800s and the slave rebellions, there was this constant fear in the South that these rebellious bands of slaves were going to rape white women. And again, so it inverts the reality. Then, after Reconstruction, when the Jim Crow regime comes in, people of color have almost no standing in the legal system. So it essentially gave white men all this impunity to rape Black, Hispanic, Native American women, and where they would never be convicted, right? And again, though, um, the narrative is again of the it's what's called the brute caricature of the Black man as this violent, lustful, rapacious agent. So during
And it
the
cost
Jim
Emmett Till his life.
Right. So the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, where 300 up to 300 African Americans were killed, where the U.S. Army bombed the town, and the mobs would be whipped into a frenzy by newspaper accounts, lurid, extremely racist newspaper accounts of Black men sexually assaulting and raping white women. So that's what led to the Tulsa race massacre. Rosewood, Florida was the same thing. There was another one in Atlanta, Georgia, all around this era, which was where there was just all these race massacres going on, because this was when nativism and the KKK were both at their peak. And so it's a complete inversion of reality. And then throughout the 20th century, we have it's Edward Said's masterwork, Orientalism, where this now gets transferred on the other, where the West constructs the East as backward, barbaric, superstitious, irrational, violent, these images of Arabs just obsessed with white women and the whole white slave trope. So again, it gets projected onto um, basically
The
the
other.
global South as a large, right? It's not just the Arab world, right? This is also about China and India and Africa and so on. And then, as U.S. empire goes abroad, it brings the sexual violence with it, and sexual trafficking. So the occupation of Japan, there's huge amount of sexual violence and trafficking. Korea, Vietnam, and even up to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that the U.S. so destroyed these societies that women were trafficked in a massive scale into the sex industry. So basically, sexually enslaved, right? Again, this is a complete inversion. There was one point in 2010 where it was estimated 50,000 Iraqi women and girls were sexually had been trafficked into the sex industry in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And so what Israel doing is exactly the same, because even as the West is amplifying, validating these rape claims, and again, they've completely fallen apart. The Screams Without Words story, the New York Times has retracted the story about the Unit 669 paramedic, or they didn't retract it, but they published another report saying that video surfaced showing that the two girls he claimed had been sexual assaulted, it was like not true, that they were fully clothed, and that there was no evidence of whatsoever. And even though the paramedic is claiming, oh yeah, it did happen, Sherry Mendez, Haaretz a few weeks ago completely discredited her story. All the Zaka volunteers, all their stories have been completely discredited. Raz Cohen, who is this Israeli former IDF Special Forces unit soldier who claimed he saw mass rape, a gang rape on October 7th. He's basically refuses to talk to the media because his story has been discredited, right? And this woman Sapir, who won't come before the public, her story is just so outlandish. So this has all basically been discredited, but at the same time, Israel is carrying out systematic gender based violence against Palestinian women and girls in Gaza, but the West Bank as well. And there is significant evidence of sexual violence. So, gender based violence is things like the fact that over 1 million women and girls have been made into refugees. They've lost their homes. The destruction of sanitation, electricity, clean water, food, fuel, all that means they don't have access to healthcare. They do not have any access to manage their menstrual cycle, which is very in to do it in like while you're being genocided is adding to the trauma and potential for disease and complications. Something I think there's been like over 7,000 Palestinian mothers who've been killed. There's something like over 17,000 Palestinian orphans. There's, I think, something like 150,000 Palestinian women who are breastfeeding, who can no longer breastfeed, basically,
Because of a
because
lack of nutrition.
of lack of nutrition. There's hundreds of birth complications every week because there's I think over 60,000 pregnant Palestinian women. There's all the babies that are being born now are being born underweight. There was a recent report from these UN experts, and this is what Israel is using these mass rape claims to try to shut down these UN experts and these two UN special rapporteurs, Francesca Albanese, who is the special rapporteur for occupied Palestine, and then Rema Al Salem, who's the special rapporteur for conflict related violence against women and girls. They've been issuing all these reports, and these Zio feminists have been trying to basically completely discredit and silence them and using the fake rape claims. So this is that colonial inversion, right? Where Israel is putting forward this just giant hoax and the media is completely amplifying it. It's been their only effective hasbara, but it is starting to fall apart. And, I will say that I'm honored to have played a small role in helping to
I'd like to
discredit.
get into the specifics of that, but before I do, because there are also now persistent reports of sexual violence against Palestinian women in, for example, the prison system, and that we've seen very little about in the media.
Yes, yes. And we have to hold everything to the same standards, right? And so like, the UN experts did say there are reports of two Palestinian women who've been raped, but that's all it is. We need to see more evidence. But I will tell you what I have seen. Just like I said, Ahmet Susanna is credible. I have seen numerous videos, and I have them bookmarked, of Palestinian women completely distraught, who they're walking, right? They're refugees. They're telling stories like, the Israeli soldiers invaded our home. They often would kill the men, or at least the father, sometimes the elder son, sometimes,
Primarily execute them.
yes, just murder them.
Mhm.
They'd force all the women to strip. So again, that right there is sexual violence,
Mhm.
as opposed to gender-based violence. And then they would search them. and that's sexual assault. There is also an UNRWA report that I haven't seen any evidence it's been released yet, but Al Jazeera got a hold of it. And this UNRWA report, so Israel is kidnapping thousands, right? We don't talk about these hostages. They're kidnapping thousands of people from Gaza, taking them into Israel, where essentially they're running these gulags where they're torturing people to death. And then, a lot of them, they're not torturing them all to death. A lot of them get released. So UNRWA did this interviews of over 1,000 Palestinians who had been returned to Gaza. They're interviewing them as they return about the conditions, and it's just all sorts of horrific torture, physical torture, psychological torture. And in the report, according to Al Jazeera, it says the torture included sticking these electric sticks up their sexual organs, right? So they are
Men and
raping
women. Hmm.
men and women. So they are raping them with sexual, with torture, instruments of torture. It's far more horrific than anything the Israelis are claiming. And we've also seen, everyone in the world has seen these pictures of Palestinian men being stripped to their underwear, and there are videos of them being stripped naked and humiliated. This is also sexual violence, right? And we know for a fact that there's this history of Israel raping Palestinians, including children, in their jails. The State Department official, I think, what was his name? Josh
Josh
Paul,
Paul. Yeah.
who resigned last fall in protest, that he talked openly about how the State Department had verified this account of a Palestinian child being raped, a boy being raped in Israeli prisons. And when they I took this evidence to Israel, its response was to raid the offices of the Palestinian Human Rights Group, shut it down, steal all their equipment and computers, and declare them a terrorist organization.
Hmm.
Right. So here, what we have is highly credible evidence that Israel systematically, and I believe, I've seen B'Tselem reports in the past. That's in the one of
Israeli Human
the, I
Rights
think,
Organization. Yeah.
that's held in very high regard about rape of Palestinian children. I mean, it's horrifying,
Hmm.
right? This stuff is all well documented, and yet what we see from the media is just these vile lies that are not really much better than what happened in Tulsa, the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa in 1921, with newspapers using the N word and talking in these lurid, vicious ways. And we see the exact same thing from the New York Times, the Atlantic. Thomas Friedman describing Arabs as parasitoid
Insects. Yeah.
wasps and insects. It's like,
Hmm.
and a good friend of mine, the journalist Ari Paul, he did a piece for Fair showing like the language he was using was exactly the same as Der Stürmer, the vicious Nazi newspaper used against the Jews. It was so vicious that the editor, the publisher of it, was hung at
Nuremberg.
Nuremberg. Julius
Stryker.
Streicher, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's just like the New York Times is basically pulling a Der Stürmer, but it's all the media, right? And if we talk about, as you know, I covered the student protests in New York City. They were just the most wonderful, inspiring, strategic, disciplined, militant, and peaceful protests I have ever seen. And yet you have Netanyahu, who's so shaken by them and scared of them. He gives a speech where he says it's like Germany in 1938, and then days later, Dana Bash on CNN
Does the
says
same thing.
it's like Europe in the 1930s, and I don't say that lightly. And the thing is, like, yeah, it is Europe in the 1930s, except it's the Zionist mobs who are being funded by Jerry Seinfeld, the tedious comedian, his wife, and the lunatic Zionist billionaire Bill Ackman. They funded these Zionist mobs at UCLA to attack the pro-Palestinian encampment, and I was just like, it was, and as the police are standing by and watching, and I'm like, this is basically a microcosm of the West Bank, where the IDF accompany these basically, and this is coming from Holocaust scholars, neo-Nazi Jewish settler organizations that go in, kill, murder, and Palestinian communities and drive them out in pogroms while the IDF is protecting them. And so we see this kind of like ricochet, between what's happening, in the U.S. and what's happening abroad. But this is Hannah Arendt's important point. I'll finish in a second. That empire abroad means repression at home.
I'd like to, I'm looking at the clock, but I also want to ask you a few specific questions. And this relates also to your own investigations of this issue. You, in preparation for your first article that was published in Yes Magazine, you actually interviewed the staff of Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which is generally, I think, a highly regarded organization. But you raised very serious questions about the report that they published on this issue. And it was, I believe, earlier this week or the end of last week that that organization actually issued a mea culpa of sorts about its report, which you challenged. Tell us about
Um,
that.
well, this is one of those moments where I'll call ironically hilarious, unintentionally hilarious. So I am the only reporter who actually interviewed and did a proper interview with the author of the report. And it really doesn't matter. Her name is Hadass Ziv. And you're right, PHRI has done a lot of excellent work in the past, but kind of the frenzy and the
Oh, I was
just
sorry. I was going to ask, do you feel they were swept up in the hysteria post October 7th?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to do a call out, but I had various journalists such as yourself trying to help me place this story at other outlets, and even among left media, I have never encountered such resistance to actually. I'm talking about so many left media outlets, and so many of them, or a number of them, I twisted people's arms and got me to admit they didn't want to touch the story because they were afraid of being called rape denialists. Whereas that is exactly what Israel is doing, right? You have these Zio-feminists like Kokav El-Kayim Levy and Ruth Halperin Badari, maybe I'm getting the last name wrong, who are basically outright called the UN experts and special rapporteurs rape denialists because they were asking for evidence.
Mm.
And so I was trying to place this story, and basically I got the same attitude from Plus 972. They did. I had a Zoom discussion with them, and they started on, in my opinion, like acting like reporting on it. My take on it was rape denialism. And so it's just really unfortunate how this has been treated. But in terms of PHRI, I'm the only one who actually did an interview where I confronted her, and I'm going to put up clips of the interview because the PHRI retraction needs to be retracted. It's basically they're dissembling once again. So the thing is, what I talked to the author of the report about was like, look, let's go over the claims. And the report is so shoddy. Just one example is the witness S. Sapir, who claims, this what I call this Dantean mass rape, right? It's something out of Dante's Inferno. It's so just outrageous. The report is so shoddy that that claim is listed twice in two separate areas in the report And PHRI did not notice that. And I pointed that out. And her response was like, no, I didn't realize that. But what I was also doing, if you read the retraction, what PHRI is claiming, all this new evidence has come to light. And that is true. But I also know how to conduct an interview. And what I was asking her about, this was the evidence available to you at the time. Did you look at it? And at first she's claiming we looked at all the available evidence. And so then I went down, like the stuff about the Unit 669 paramedic, right? He claimed he found, and his story kept changing. That's a really good uh, clue that it's being fabricated. So he claimed he found a dead girl on the floor with her pants pulled down to her knees. And again, the details keep changing, with semen on her back. And not to get too graphic, but it's just like, okay, you're basically describing what sounds like a porno scene, right? This is just sounds absurd. And but that story has now been completely discredited. But in the initial interview he did on October 25th, and this is 1 month before the PHRI report, he does it with Republic TV, this right-wing Islamophobic Indian news station, where first of all, this rape allegedly happened in Kibbutz Be'eri, whereas what he says three times that it was Nahal Oz, and he even translated the name. Right? If he said it once, okay, maybe he just made an error. But the fact he said it three times and translated the name, he says Nahal Oz means river of strength. That shows there's a fabrication going on. But more significant, he then tells two fake atrocity stories, right? That's the other thing about these 12 witnesses. Eight of them have been exposed as telling fake atrocity stories, eight of the 12. So right there, you're basically, you're now only down to four
Or
witnesses who haven't been, and this was all known by the time the PHRI report came out. So he told two fake stories. One, again, one of these dead baby stories. He said, my team, and you can go Google it up, look at my article on Yes Magazine. There's links to it. He said, my team found a 1-year-old infant with stab wounds all over its body in a trash can. Okay, again, complete lie. We know the only baby killed, Israeli baby killed, was Mila Cohen in the arms of her mother, who survived. Secondly, he then says, and this is the outlandish stuff, that it's just like it fails the basic believability test if you're a reporter. There were sentences written in the blood of the Arabic sentences written in the blood of the victims on their
Charles Manson style.
I mean, it's just like, where are you? Yeah, exactly. Where are you getting this stuff from? Because there would be massive forensic evidence of that. You could just easily do a little scraping and do a DNA sample. And there's no photo or video evidence of it. I mean, come on. And how the hell do they collect it? Do they come with like all these like transfusion kits and electric pumps? I mean, the whole thing is so absurd. And that right there should have been like, this guy has no credibility. Because the thing is, imagine if a Palestinian said anything like this. We have Palestinians, the health ministry, who have been validated by the United Nations, by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, by the U.S. State Department, the Pentagon, by the IDF, as their statistics are correct and credible, and yet the media treat them as their lies,
The
and yet
Hamas-run health ministry.
yeah. I mean, that is just that's what I call, like, it's the Barack Hussein Obama of reporting, right? It's just, it doesn't add any information. It's just meant to
Discredit.
yeah, discredit, and also just generate hate in the reader, right? I mean, I've been saying that, the editorial boards of all these publications and outlets should get the Julius Streicher treatment, right? They need to be tried for incitement to genocide, and given a long drop or a short drop off of a long gallows. Um,
Um, Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to ask, last question I wanted to ask you is yesterday, Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, submitted a number of applications to the pretrial chamber of the ICC for arrest warrants. The three arrest warrants he's seeking for Hamas leaders specifically mention sexual violence as charges for which he wants these people tried. Does that mean, in your view, that the ICC has access to convincing evidence that you have not yet seen? What do you make of it?
I am very skeptical of that because I think we would have seen something. I think this is how nothing happens in a vacuum, right? The idea that the law is
Above politics.
yeah, above politics is of course absurd, right? And this is the whole the origins of critical legal theory, which has now been discredited as critical race theory. The idea that the law is embedded in society, and there had been questions. There had been not just questions, but a lot of pressure on Khan for many months about why isn't he speaking up. That this is a do nothing body, as so many of these international bodies are, right? Like what is it, the International Committee to Protect Journalists, or the Committee to
A committee to protect CPJ.
Protect
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's just like, where are they? It's just like we've seen, how I don't even know how many, is it 140 Palestinian journalists and media workers killed at this.
Something along those lines.
And yet they're like, all they do is issue these feeble press releases, right? Or that UNRWA, it goes running after Israel after it makes these again completely fabricated claims about UNRWA
Yeah.
employees participating in the October 7th attacks. So I think ICC has not basically performed. It has not acquitted itself of politics, and I think that is just, they're trying to cover their butts in that case. Just like the UN was with by sending Patton. And those initial statements that and you could see how they were trying to fudge it, right? That we're concerned, deeply concerned about these reports of sexual violence on October 7th. Um, and the fact of the matter is that they're leaving themselves this big out to say, well, they haven't been substantiated. So I see what Khan is doing is he is just basically, in the best case scenario, he's trying to cover his butt. In the worst case scenario, he's just kowtowing to Israel about this sexual violence. And it's just like, no, I don't believe that there's anything out there. I do hold out the possibility that perhaps there were more hostages that were sexually assaulted. And let me say something about that real quick, right? What I was saying earlier, and I didn't complete the thought. Her case completely undermines the Israeli narrative, because we heard, I can't tell you how many hundreds of newspaper articles. Most or all or virtually all the victims of were killed, right? All these women, we've heard Sheryl Sandberg say that, right? When there was that just grotesque meeting before the United Nations endorsing these fake rape claims on December 4th. It was the, like, we they were all killed, and so we are their voice, which is like, how do you know that again, that just completely fails like any credibility test. How do you know they were sexually assaulted if there's no forensic evidence, there's no photo or video evidence, and there are no witnesses? How do you know that they were all killed? So one, that's the Israeli claim, and then two, we saw again this total lies about that Hamas was not willing to release the female hostages because it had sexually assaulted them. And then third, that survivors will not come forward for years or decades. Again, that dehumanizes the Palestinians, both men and women, who have come forward and talked about the just humiliating, degrading. There's one Palestinian man, I think, who, plus 972 early on had a big report about this. And he was just like, I wish I was dead in terms of the sexual violence he suffered in when he was kidnapped to the West Bank. So one, Ahmed Susana shows that's a lie. Yes, some may not come forward, but many do come forward. And if you look at the history of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war, we know it's a weapon of war because women and men do come forward pretty quickly in the Congo, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Liberia, in all these conflict zones, they do come forward, and we are seeing that. Like I said, with I've seen numerous videos of Palestinian women distraught at the sexual violence.
And regarding this Israeli hostage, the narrative about people like her was, well, they're going to kill them, so they don't.
Right. And so secondly, they're all dead. Well, she's alive, and third, they don't want to release them because they sexually assaulted them. Well, they released her. I believe in that case that Hamas didn't even know that that guard had sexually assaulted her, and I'm sure he's probably not around for one reason or another after that story came out. But in any case, it showed three of the main Hasbara narratives are just total lies, right? And no one is pointing this out.
And final point, does the ICC chart sheet show that this remains a relevant and important issue?
Yes, the fact that Israel is now arguing before the ICJ that sexual violence that has happened or may happen against hostages is a reason it needs to engage in this horrific assault against Rafah. It has actually said that in the last week, I believe, in or sometime in May, before the ICJ, as South Africa is seeking an injunction to stop the assault on Rafah, which of course has not been stopped. It's going on as we speak. But we see how Israel keeps mobilizing it because it serves all these different purposes, right? They portray Hamas as like ISIS. They keep the society in this frenzied state, and the idea that these like filthy savages are defiling our white women, it cuts at the core of Israeli masculinity and their racial superiority narrative. It's is the cover for the genocide, and it keeps the notion that the October 7th atrocities are still continuing to this day. So it serves many purposes, and the media have played completely along with this incitement to genocide. And we're finally starting to only see the story dropping off because so many of these alleged witnesses have now been discredited.
Arun Gupta, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for having